Greetings, fellow humans. So, we all know the Victorians did some pretty questionable stuff, but I was fascinated to learn just how far so many of them would go for the sake of fashion. These days we think about fabric and clothing as things that can come in any manner of colours and patterns, but that has only been even vaguely possible for the last 150 years or so. Natural, unbleached and undyed fabric is, generally speaking, pretty beige. So trying to make fabric more interesting by dyeing it is something human beings have been doing for literal millennia. Now, fabric dyes can be divided into two categories: synthetic dyes and natural dyes. Natural dyes can be derived from plant, animal, or mineral sources. For example, in Europe, ancient plant dyes could be made from madder, woad, birch bark, lady's bed straw, oak galls, and more. There are some pretty famous natural animal dyes like Tyrian purple or cochineal red, but even mineral dyes had their celebrities. The colour khaki was originally created by soaking fabric in a solution of equal parts iron salts and chrome alum, and then developing the dye in some sort of alkaline bath. The trouble with natural dyes is they varied a lot in how strong the colour was and in how long that colour stuck around. Mineral and animal dyes generally tended to be more colour-fast than plant dyes. Regardless, dyeing fabric was a very labour-intensive process, and particularly plant-based natural dyes required multiple steps, including using chemical mordants to try and fix the dyes to the fabric. But even with all that work, it was still possible for the colours to fade pretty dramatically over time, which is why when commercially produced synthetic chemical dyes came onto the scene in 19th century Europe, everyone absolutely and totally lost their shit. Now, most information you will find about synthetic fabric dyes will tell you that they were invented in 18th and 19th century Europe, which isn't quite true. Egyptian blue was a synthetic blue pigment that was first synthesized during ancient Egypt's 4th dynasty, and there is evidence of it being used to colour a range of medium, including canvas fabric. It spread throughout the Mediterranean and the Roman Empire, but fell out of use when the Roman Empire collapsed, and by the 7th century had essentially disappeared. But let's fast forward a millennium or so, because in the 18th century, Scheele was a very busy boy. In the 1770s, Mr. Scheele released a vivid synthetic green pigment that took Europe by storm. Previous to his invention, the only green pigments available were malachite or verdigris, neither of which had very much intensity. So when Scheele released Scheeles Green, people jumped at the chance to transform their wallpapers, upholstery, even their clothes. Unfortunately, Scheeles Green had the tendency to blacken over time, so in 1814, a few competitors brought out alternatives, including Paris Green. The trouble was, all these green pigments and dyes had the same base, so they became known as arsenical pigments. And if you just had a little internal moment of going, wait, arsenical? Arsenical like arsenic? Yes, like arsenic. They contained arsenic. In the Georgian and Victorian era, there seems to have been this really strange disconnect with arsenic. They were well aware that you could use it to get rid of rats or to off your husband, but it didn't seem to occur to people that putting arsenic in or on things like wallpaper, wall paints, clothing dye, artificial foliage attached to hats, cosmetics, children's toys, food packaging, or food colorants used in pickles, sweets, or ice cream would pose any kind of problem. So after Scheeles Green and Paris Green were out in the world and households across Britain had installed their oh-so-chic and oh-so-poisonous wallpaper, the downsides, the less desirable bits of having an arsenic green home started to creep up on people. The arsenical pigments in wallpaper often flaked off the walls, and because inhalation of the compound was harmful, even brushing against the wall and just breathing, you know, like we all do, could have some pretty harmful consequences. In 1839, a well-known German chemist formed a theory that green wallpapers were causing harm, not only because of the pigments flaking off of the wallpaper, just hanging out in the air waiting to be inhaled, but because the combination of the green wallpapers and the damp in British homes were causing the release of poisonous gases, and he urged the German public to avoid arsenical greens in their home through a report to a German daily paper at the time. A short while later, the first major case of poisoning came to the British public's attention. Originally attributed to diphtheria, 4 children in Limehouse, London, died, all suffering from sore throats and respiratory troubles. Their deaths weren't linked to arsenic poisoning until a public health officer named Henry Perkin heard the children's bedroom had recently been papered in green and decided to examine the wallpaper. It was found to contain a lethal dose of arsenic in every square foot. In December 1860, the Glasgow Herald ran an article that quoted Dr. Letherby. The writer said the article should put an end to all controversy as to the danger to health and life from arsenical papers. In the article, Dr. Letherby spoke of another investigation into the deaths of 2 children who had regularly played in a room with green wallpaper. Letherby stated, "I found that it was an arsenical paper, containing nearly 52 grains of arsenite copper on a square foot, and the pigment was so loosely attached to the paper that it was removed by the slightest friction. 5 square inches of the paper was capable of producing all the symptoms observed in the boy, and the pigment from a piece 6 inches square would have sullied for the death of 2 adult persons." The article pulled no punches, going on to say, "It is a very serious question for a civilized country whether paper hangers should be suffered to pursue their trade profits at the certain cost of more or less injury to the health of their work people, and at the cost, sometimes mortal, to their customers." And all that before I even get to the clothes. Because there was plenty of arsenical attire, and it was doing plenty of damage. A sample piece of green muslin analysed by George Rees that had been destined to become a ball gown contained such a high concentration of Scheeles Green that a woman wearing a full ball gown made of the fabric would have had up to 1,000 grains of arsenic concealed on her person. There were reports of all the performers portraying water nymphs in a ballet being poisoned by their costumes. And it wasn't just dresses that people needed to watch out for. Arsenical dyes could be lurking in hats, shirts, trousers, boot linings, paper collars and cuffs, hat bands, stockings, and socks. In fact, multiple people, including one MP, were left disabled, unable to walk or stand by arsenical socks. Poisoned by socks. Like, it would be hilarious if it wasn't tragic. And then, in the 1850s, the growing trend for hats that sported elaborate constructions of feathers and artificial flora added to the arsenical issue. Not just for the wearers, either. Due to the popularity of the trend, there were soon thousands of artificial florists. I managed to find, in my research, a description of how some of this artificial foliage was made. The leaves were made of wax, and, while wet, emerald green powder was sprinkled upon them. And if you were wondering, yes, that emerald green powder did contain arsenic. So unsurprisingly, artificial florists who were being exposed to this substance that could poison them by ingestion, skin absorption, or inhalation experienced some pretty gnarly physical effects. In fact, that manufacturing description was taken from an article about the death of 19-year-old Matilda Scheele, published in the Leeds Mercury in November 1861. She was an artificial florist who had been ill multiple times with the same symptoms, and over the 18 months before her death, she had been attended 4 times by Surgeon James Thomas Paul. On those 4 occasions, she had improved under his care, but sadly, this time, she did not. The day before she died, she was seized by bouts of vomiting, the contents of her stomach being green in colour, and after her death, it was noted in the post-mortem that not only were her skin and nails of a greenish hue, but also that the whites of her eyes had turned green as well. And at the end of the article, it mentions that a sister of Matilda Scheele, I assume that worked in the same factory, had died under similar circumstances. As the 19th century advanced, the reports of arsenic poisoning from wallpaper and clothing mounted. It was such a commonly known issue that Punch, in its usual sensitive fashion, poked fun at the unnecessary deaths of thousands with a satirical image accompanied by song lyrics titled "The Arsenic Waltz." The image was captioned with the phrase, "The New Dance of Death," and in parentheses, dedicated to green wreath and dressmongers. Unfortunately, as is disturbingly common in capitalism, to protect the pockets and profits of the industrialists making this stuff, the British government refused to take any action to curb the use of arsenic in the production of, well, anything. So the public took things into their own hands, specifically requesting and only purchasing arsenic-free wallpaper, which eventually meant the likes of William Morris, who, it should be noted, profited from his family's arsenic-producing mine, as well as from the arsenic-laced wallpapers he designed and sold, to finally give in and limit or remove arsenic from consumer products. But thankfully, the 1850s brought some welcome scientific advances that made it easier to move away from arsenic-based pigments. In 1856, at the fresh young age of just 18 years, chemistry student William Henry Perkin made a discovery, entirely by accident. He'd been trying to create a synthetic alternative for quinine, which was, at the time, the only medical remedy available for malaria. And as the British Empire colonised more and more territories in tropical areas, finding an inexpensive way of treating soldiers for malaria was essential for the British to hold on to power. Assistant to the chemist who had been tasked with achieving this feat, William tried some independent experiments as well. He decided to try synthesizing quinine by oxidizing aniline, which was a clear, yellowish liquid extracted from an industrial byproduct, coal tar. William Henry Perkin did not synthesize quinine. What he created instead was a black, sludgy residue in his beaker, and when he attempted to clean it away, wiping out his beaker with ethanol, it smudged into the most brilliant, bright purple colour. Mr. Perkin, well, he had the sense to see the commercial potential of this. You see, up until this point in history, purple clothing had only been for those who could afford it. Tyrian purple was incredibly expensive because it required the shells of literally thousands of sea snails to create even a tiny amount of the pigment. It was so prized that its use had been limited by law in ancient Rome. So William Perkins's creation of this aniline purple dye, which became known as mauve or mauvine, meant that suddenly the highest status colour of clothing in existence was accessible to normal people. Oh boy, did they get excited about it. Over the following years, an enormous number of aniline-based dye colours were developed, including some green dyes that could finally replace their arsenic-based predecessors. And thank the stars, aniline dyes were less toxic than Scheeles Green or Paris Green. Less toxic. Definitely not non-toxic. The trouble being that aniline is toxic, not only by inhalation of the vapours or ingestion, but also by percutaneous absorption, which, if you don't know, means absorption through the skin, which is kind of a problem for a piece of clothing that you're going to put on your body that's covered in skin. Aniline dyes could cause irritation and inflammation of the skin, it could cause sores, and even bladder cancer. But that didn't seem to stop anybody wearing it. In fact, there was such an enormous flood of people wearing mauve clothing in the first years after the dye's creation that Punch magazine ran a humorous article in August 1860 titled Mauve Measles. In the article, it describes women being affected by a malady or mania of sorts, saying that some learned men ascribe its origin directly to the French. It goes on to say, while the mind is certainly affected by the malady, it is chiefly on the body that its effects are noticeable, and having most maturely considered the complaint, Dr. Punch is of the opinion that it is not so much a mania as a species of measles. Now, the article is satirical, so it clearly isn't a reliable primary source. But because these dyes were water-soluble, early aniline dyes leaching out of the fabrics and onto the skin of the wearer was a well-documented phenomenon at the time. And with what we know now about aniline dyes being an irritant to the skin that can cause sores, it isn't unreasonable to assume that there were widespread cases of rashes akin to measles on people wearing mauve clothing. And while there was great excitement and great love for these dyes, there was also a huge disdain for them. When aniline magenta was created, the vivid pink absolutely took off and was hugely significant in terms of fashion at the time and fashion history. But some people absolutely loathed it, with one Victorian tastemaker, Gertrude Jekyll, dubbing it malignant magenta. And she had fair reason to. The companies making these dyes were always looking for cheaper ways to produce them, so after a year or two they decided to change the production method and started using arsenic acid as a reactant in the magenta dye. So as well as the usual can cause sores and cancer of aniline dyes, the manufacturer of magenta-based dyes created an arsenic compound as a byproduct, which was named London Purple, contained 30 to 50% arsenic, and was highly soluble. So not only was it dangerous for the people wearing things dyed with magenta, there were also some pretty severe health risks for the factory workers making it, not to mention some serious and pretty obvious environmental risks. As the 19th century pushed on and synthetic dyes became huge business, different types of synthetic dyes were developed. In the 1870s, Peter Gries and two others declared themselves to be the discoverers of the first azo dyes, which were, you guessed it, still toxic. Not only that, they were also carcinogenic and mutagenic. They could literally mutate people's genes, which is, horrifying. And there are plenty of other fabric dyes that came after that still had their risks. In an article published in 1909, while discussing the tied and dyed textiles of India, Charles Pellew suggested that home dyers forewent the more easily used salt dyes of the time, expressing doubt that the salt colours sold in packages at the druggists would be fast either to light or to washing, and instead urged the use of sulphur dyes. Only problem with that is the fumes from sulphur dyes can be, in a word, noxious. And if you weren't careful what kind of dye vessel you used and just happened to try doing your dyeing in a pot made of a metal that would react with the sulphur in the dyes, you'd be in for a pretty nasty shock. If, for instance, you decided to use an iron pot in which to situate your sulphur dye bath, it would quite probably literally burst into flames. I'm not joking. So as we can see, people taking stupid risks with their well-being for the sake of remaining fashionable is not new. And thankfully, over the last century and a bit, the push for consumers' rights, for workers' rights, and the increasing restriction and legislation around production techniques means that we don't have to worry about Scheeles Green or mauve measles anymore. But that doesn't mean all our clothes are safe. Just last year, multiple products from online fast fashion retailers Shein, AliExpress, and Zaful were tested by Canadian scientists, and 1 in 5 items were found to have elevated levels of toxic chemicals. In fact, a toddler's jacket from Shein contained 20 times the level of lead that Health Canada deems safe for children. On top of lead, which can have negative health impacts on the brain, heart, kidneys, and reproductive system, poorly produced modern clothing can also contain PFCs, PFAs, phthalates, formaldehyde, chromium, and azo dyes. Those ones I mentioned earlier that can mutate your genes? Yeah, they're still around. Mostly, ironically, used in denim products like jeans. The J type of jeans. The garment jeans. Those ones. So with those terrifying revelations now floating around in the ether, you might be wondering how you can avoid buying clothes that are going to harm you. Well, the first thing you can do is just not buy clothes. And by that I mean cut back on buying new clothes. Wear what you already have. And in particular, avoid buying fast fashion, especially from ultra-fast fashion brands like Shein, Zaful, and the like. The second is if you do have to buy something new and you're unsure if it might be harmful, wash it before you wear it. Thirdly, look for garments made from organic fibres, or look for labels marked Global Organic Textile Standard or Standard 100. That means the fabrics have been tested and don't contain harmful substances. It's It's kind of easy as modern day human people to look back at the Victorians and all the appalling effects these pigments and dyes were having and kind of laugh at them. Just have that moment of thinking how completely ridiculous. They kept making this stuff that they knew was hurting the people buying it and the people manufacturing it and the places they lived, and they just kept doing it. And for what? So people who could afford to could be on the cutting edge of fashion and show off about having a new emerald green or magenta pink dress. Like, wow. Those old-timey people were so backwards and so foolish. Then you look at the modern fashion industry and like, not that much has changed. So, if you take anything away from this video, let it be this. Fashion isn't really worth it. Especially with the speed of what's in style changing at an ever-increasing and honestly baffling rate, and with the way that fashion trends go in cycles, it's totally pointless to try and keep up with it. Especially if you might be exposing yourself to dangerous levels of toxic chemicals in the process. Remember kids, fashion is fleeting. Brain damage from lead poisoning is forever. Anyway, I hope you enjoyed this horrifying deep dive into fashion history and fabric dye. If you liked the video, because like me, you're morbidly fascinated by this kind of stuff, commenting, sharing it on social media, all that stuff really helps me out. If you'd like to keep up with future videos from me, that'd be really cool. But whether you decide to keep hanging out or not, hope you don't have any arsenic in your wallpaper. I'll see you all next time. What?
Tension?
I need to do things. Be quiet.
I claw.
No, don't do that. Come here.
But why?
Get Betty scratches.
No.
Sludgy residue.
I do climb. While she not look.
What he?
Oh no.
No.
Please?